Well, thank you, everybody. We're mindful of time, so I know that people will probably be joining us in the next few minutes, but I'll go ahead and get us started since the hour tends to go by very quickly. I'd just like to introduce myself briefly. So I am Zab Johnson. I am the Executive Director and Senior Fellow at the Wharton Neuroscience Initiative. And together with Michael Platt, who is the faculty director for the Wharton Neuroscience Initiative, we have been co-moderating these fantastic panel discussions for the last couple of months with the aim of really trying to bring together brain science and business and talk about themes that are relevant to current events, but from the lenses of neuroscience, psychology, and business and other disciplines. In an effort to really begin to build community and connect and generate ideas and come together and share knowledge. So thank you for joining us this week. The aim of our initiative is to bring together brain science and business in an effort to improve business, drive new discoveries and applications, and enhance the education of future leaders. Today's theme, of course, is on bias, power, persuasion, and action. It's a pretty rich and deep theme, and we've got a really fantastic panel of people that are really incredible scholars working in these areas that I think will share some really important perspectives on their work. And so, we have the responsibility to look through many lenses at how we can understand these issues and how we're perpetuating inequities and systemic racism, and how we can better strive for real and long-lasting change, not only in business, but in society writ large. So I'd like to briefly introduce today's panelists, then I'm going to turn things over to Michael Platt, who will do an introduction himself, and then we'll get started with today's discussion. Our first panelist is Mina Zagara. She's the Associate Professor of Psychology at Harvard University and Director of the Intergroup Neuroscience Lab. Her lab studies how group membership and prejudice change the course of social cognition and the behavioral consequences of these processes. Our next panelist is Keith Payne. He is a professor of psychology and neuroscience at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. His lab studies how inequality shapes the mind and brain, and he's also the author of a recent book that I thought I would point out that is published by Penguin Random House called The Broken Ladder, and we will be sharing links for some of these labs and books and centers for you all in the chat window very shortly. And our third panelist is Deborah Thomas. She is the R. Gene Brownlee Professor of Anthropology at the University of Pennsylvania and the Director of the Center for Experimental Ethnography. She's also core faculty in Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies and holds a secondary appointment with the Graduate School of Education and is a member of the graduate groups in English, Africana Studies, and the School of Social Policy and Practice. She's the author of multiple books, including Modern Blackness, Nationalism, Globalization, and the Politics of Culture in Jamaica, and Exceptional Violence, Embodied Citizenship in Transnational Jamaica, and as well as a forthcoming book on political life in the wake of the plantation. So we'd like this session to be as interactive as possible, but we ask that you please put your questions into the chat window, which is on the right or the left side of your application, depending on whether you're using the browser version or the app itself. And so you'll see that in there. That allows us to sort of get to your questions when it's timely and relevant to the conversation. It allows you to remember what your question is if we invite you to ask it yourself on camera. And it helps us make sure that we're really following through and coming up with ways of making this as dynamic and interactive as possible. So with that, I will pass the reins over to Michael Platt.
Thanks, Zab, and thank you everyone for joining us, and especially our panelists, some old friends, some new friends and neighbors, and we're wonderful scholars. So just so grateful to have you here. And As the faculty director of the Wharton Neuroscience Initiative, I just wanted to take a moment to, I think, make clear that we're having this particular conversation. We're having it now because the brutal killings of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and Taylor, and many others have thrown into stark and painful relief what the pandemic was already beginning to reveal, which is the systemic racism across our society in terms of policing, in terms of healthcare, in terms of access to education and jobs. And so I just want to make very clear that the Wharton Neuroscience Initiative is committed to working to end racism, to learn from the lived experience of Black people, people of color, and other marginalized communities, and especially from the work of our colleagues, some of whom we have here today, and to put this into practice in terms of what and how we teach, the research we do, in particular our work with business leaders in the corporate community, and our efforts in society at large. And so with that, I would like to now begin the panel discussion by asking Mia to say a few brief remarks.
Great, thank you. Can you all hear me? Yes, excellent. Okay, well, first I want to thank you, Michael and Zab, very much for this invitation, and also Deborah and Keith. I'm really excited to have this conversation with all of you and everyone else who's joined us on the call. I want to give you a little bit more background about where I'm coming from and how I'm thinking about some of these issues. So as Zab mentioned, my research is all about how group living shapes people's thoughts, their emotions, their brain responses, and their behavior. So I study, for example, how processes like empathy and communication break down when the social context shifts from me and you interacting as individuals to us and them, or us interacting as individuals as representatives of our social groups. But more than that, I'm even interested in the behavioral consequences of these processes breaking down, so discrimination, conflict, and collective violence. So we know, of course, that humans and many other species very reliably divide the world up into us and them. And on one hand, this is great, right? We reap numerous material and psychological benefits by being able to identify fellow group members, to coordinate, cooperate with one another, to take care of each other. But on the other hand, group living also produces tremendous pressure to conform within groups, making us do or say things we might not otherwise do or say if we were acting as individuals. It is, of course, also the source of intractable conflict between groups. And, you know, by some accounts, intergroup conflict is one of the greatest problems facing the world today. It's obviously very relevant and topical these days immediately, as Michael has already mentioned. And by some counts, the last century has seen over 170 million civilians killed in acts of genocide, war, and other forms of group conflict. And just to give you a little bit of background about myself personally, in hindsight, I realized that my interest in these questions stem largely from my personal experience growing up. So I was born in Belgrade, which is in former Yugoslavia, which is now presently Serbia. My father's side of the family is Serbian. My mom's side of the family is Bosnian. And it was very confusing for my parents, their family members, and much of the rest of the world, how it was that, you know, you could see in the 90s during the Balkan Wars, people who went from marrying across ethnic boundaries, like my parents, or raising each other's children, sending their kids to the same schools, existing peacefully for 60 years as part of a united republic, to moving to the bloodiest genocide on European soil following World War II. So as a social psychologist, what I've come to understand is that we're often at our worst in service of trying to be good group members, that there are these competing impulses between what makes us good people versus good group members. And the bottom line is that intergroup dynamics like these fundamentally reshape our views on what is fair or acceptable, and therefore represent a really critical boundary condition on the way we think about morality and justice. And as Michael's already mentioned, this pandemic has cast all of these dynamics into very high relief, right? So we know already that being threatened with disease is often associated with higher levels of ethnocentrism. We know greater fear and perceived threat are associated with greater intolerance and punitive attitudes and behaviors towards outgroup members. But there are also, this is piggybacking on so many other threats that have been activated, right? So prior to the pandemic, we had a lot of discussion about shifting demographics and the sort of perceived symbolic threat that goes along with that. So, you know, the perception that inflows of immigrants and refugees are going to change the American way of life, as a result of the pandemic's fiscal impact, now we have economic threat, which has been compounded, right? How am I going to feed my family? Am I doing worse off than my neighbors? So really there's threat coming from everywhere. And when things go this bad, we really like to be able to have an agent to blame because it gives us a greater sense of control. So one of the things that I think it's important to talk about is the role that leaders play in shaping our responses to these kinds of compacted threats or compounded threats, right? Leaders can understand that people look for agents to blame, and that can give us leverage. They can leverage this information to give a sense that they've isolated the cause of the threat and are ready to act on it, right? You see this manifesting as references to the Wuhan virus in the context of the pandemic, legislation against Antifa and Black Lives Matter in the context of the protests, right? These are the distortions in how we locate responsibility for the current state of affairs, but they're distortions that work to divide us, because highlighting these group boundaries can undermine our understanding of these other groups and empathy that are socially distant from our own groups. They increase dehumanization and collective violence against these groups. And the thing that many political leaders understand is that if people are afraid, you can make them feel like they're in a defensive crouch. And the reason this is so dangerous is because most people believe that you have a right to defend yourself. So almost anything you do in the name of self-defense or defense of your group is going to be morally acceptable. And I think that's how it is that we end up seeing so much of the atrocious behavior and acts that we're seeing these days. And I just want to talk about, some of the psychological origins of those things. So anyway, that's what I mean when I say we're often at our worst in service of being good group members. So with that, I'll wrap it up and pass it to Keith and Deborah.
Great.
Thanks. Go ahead, Keith.
Thanks. Well, thank you all for having me and for all of you for being part of this conversation. It's as Michael said, it's kind of a painful and poignant time to be talking about this, but it's also, I think, even more important that we wrestle with some of these issues head on and don't sort of duck and wait until the high pressure situation has passed us over. So I'm happy to be here and to be talking about my research, which is on the effects of economic inequality and racial inequality. So in general, I'm interested in what's the effect for the average person of being thrust sort of into a situation of high inequality or a low inequality environment. So for example, economic inequality is really a resource-focused type of thing. So if we find ourselves in a high inequality situation, what we tend to do is focus on the top. We focus on the people who have a lot of money, a lot of wealth, a lot of resources. And the psychological consequence of that is that the average person ends up feeling poorer by comparison. They end up feeling like they need more to be satisfied. They need more to just sort of be a normal middle-class person who has enough. And because of that, the effects of income inequality tend to mimic behaviorally the effects of poverty. So we see that high inequality situations lead people to engage in more high-risk behavior, more impulsive decision-making, often more self-defeating behavior, and that's even for an average person who's not themselves poor. So that's one aspect of inequality that I'm interested in. The second one is racial inequality, what it's like to be thrust into a high inequality environment in terms of racial disparities. And racial inequality is really identity focused rather than resource focused. And so the effects of that racial inequality in the environment really depend on the identities that we're bringing to that situation. So the effects for somebody who's in the high status or advantage group of being in a high inequality situation tend to be that they start generating justifications and rationalizations for why that hierarchy is the way it is. And if you're a member of the lower status or disadvantaged group, that same situation tends to lead people to focus on discriminations and barriers for why that inequality is the way it is. And so not only does that end up perpetuating those inequalities themselves, but it also creates more barriers for being able to discuss with each other and to reach compromise across the lines with those identities, echoing many of the points that Mina was making. So I'm especially interested in the differences between implicit and explicit prejudice and what makes someone reject the sort of stereotypes that pop automatically into all of our heads when we're faced with high inequality situations versus what makes people go ahead and endorse them and justify them. And in my work, we argue that that's basically what makes the difference between implicit prejudice, which is all around us all the time, versus explicit prejudice, where we take up that cause and actually justify and defend it as our attitudes and beliefs. And lately, I've become especially interested in the ways that implicit and explicit prejudice can really reflect more about the environment around us and the time and the place than something about the person and their beliefs. So we've been very interested in looking at how geography and the history of slavery and Jim Crow might be more important for creating and maintaining implicit and explicit bias, as well as the systemic racism around us than any particular individual's belief system. So we're very interested in trying to connect these ideas of implicit and explicit bias at the individual level to these larger issues of systemic racism. So I'll stop there.
Great, thank you very much. Deborah, go ahead.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. And I also want to just extend my thanks to Michael and to Zab for inviting me to participate in this gathering. Like my co-panelists, my research has been attentive to issues related to structural racism, structural inequality, and violence. I'm a cultural anthropologist, or more properly, a political anthropologist. Many of you know that anthropology is a four-field endeavor, and I do ethnography, which means that I develop knowledge collaboratively with other people while I'm participating in their lives in a variety of ways. And some people have called this kind of methodological approach deep hanging out. So my focus has been on issues related to sovereignty and state making, and therefore also on state violence and racism. I've been interested in the afterlives of imperialism and slavery, in the structures and systems that perpetuate inequalities and hierarchies, similarly to my co-panelists. And I'm also interested in the kinds of worlds that people have created and constructed for themselves that generate a new set of relationships that contest these systems of power and privilege, and that are aimed to counter these historical inequalities. Mostly I do my research in the post-colonial Anglophone world, specifically in Jamaica, which is where I spent my early childhood and where my family is from. But I think we've seen in recent weeks that issues of state violence and anti-Black racism are clearly global issues. We've seen this in part in the global response to George Floyd's murder. Specifically in relation to Jamaica, Jamaica has one of the highest rates of extrajudicial killing in the world. And my most recent book was catalyzed by a state of emergency in 2010 in a community in downtown Kingston, which has become referred to now as the Tivoli incursion, during which combined forces of the military and the police went into a community in order to extract somebody who had been ordered for extradition to the United States to stand trial for gun and drug running charges. And in the process, they killed at least officially 75 civilians, though the number of community members put forward is typically around 200. And in the book and in the film and in an installation project that generated out of this research, we make a lot of effort to think through the connections between the U.S. Police force, the U.S. military, and other Western Hemisphere locations in order to show that these global patterns are not just emerging from the kinds of migration that Mina talked about, but also from investment within military and police departments throughout the Western Hemisphere. I should say also that I run a center called, as Zab mentioned, called the Center.
Est-ce que tu as vu un cadre qui part?
Ben alors, ta main?
Non, mais les jaunes.
Is that someone else? Sorry, I run the center called the Center for Experimental Ethnography at Penn, which is a cross-school endeavor made up of faculty who do some kind of creative practice in their research process. Sometimes this is film, performance, photography, creative writing, other kinds of visual arts. And I'm committed to this because my own background prior to coming into academia was as a professional dancer and a theatrical performer. I performed for many years with a company called Urban Bushwomen, which is a company that used a research to performance methodology in order to amplify the voices of African diasporic people and women in particular. So when I started thinking about getting a PhD, I was interested in how artists expressed a political vision through their work and also in the role of the arts within social movements. I went home to Jamaica because dancers were a critical part of the anti-colonial movement there, and that sort of began this long inquiry I've had into state formation and state building in that context. So the Center for Experimental Ethnography really seeks to support this kind of work, both from faculty and from students, because we believe that a creative practice and what we call multimodal research changes the ways that we interact with our students, changes the ways we interact with our research interlocutors, and also changes the relationship of the university to the communities in which it's located and with which it interacts. And we also believe that multimodal research practices open up academia to communities that have, for a variety of reasons, been or felt excluded from the world of scholarship or the life of the mind. And so we also exist to provide and create additional pipelines toward academic work that's more inclusive and accountable to the communities in which it circulates. So I think I'll stop there for now, and I'll be interested to hear more from the other panelists and from the participants on the call.
Well, thank you all. That is fascinating and important. I would love to hear all of your work for the entire afternoon. But we have about 35 minutes left or so we're going to go ahead and dive right in. I want to first circle back to Mina, and I just want to ask if you could provide a little bit more depth on what happens in the brain when we are encountering or thinking about somebody as an other versus us, right? And is that different, or how is it different when we're in groups versus an individual, me versus?
Sure. So I think that one of the things there's a very recent history of the sort of endeavor to understand how it is that what specific brain processes contribute to sort of rendering another person as represented as us or them, or you one of us or you one of them. And that has really focused a lot because of the people who are doing the research are based in the US, and because one of obviously the most important intergroup dynamics in the US is between white and Black Americans. So much of that research started off looking for the sort of single part of the brain that would distinguish between us versus them, and particularly among white participants, because that's where a lot of this research started, was the effects of being presented a picture of a white person versus a Black person and which region of the brain would respond. So some of the very earliest work on that located this response most consistently in a structure of the brain called the amygdala, which has historically in animal models been deeply associated with fear circuitry. So it has this placement in the brain is such that it can relay with just 2 jumps to sort of immediate behavioral responses. And the idea is that it's perfectly placed to relay fear types of responses because it can quickly engage behavior. You can have a reaction. So if you are walking on a trail and you see a snake in your path, you know to jump back right away. You don't have to deliberate on that process. And so people took these early data to indicate that fear was at the bottom of encountering somebody from the out group. But what more recent evidence indicates is that it's probably better characterized as being a fear, as being afraid of being revealed to be racist response, actually. That what was happening was people were putting a bunch of white undergraduates in the scanner and presenting them pictures of white and black targets, and then, what the participants understanding that that presumably what was happening was that their brain might be betraying them. And so every time you saw this amygdala response to black faces, it might have actually been more of a, uh-oh, is my brain betraying my racism right now? Rather than a, uh-oh, I'm afraid of black people the same way I'm afraid of spiders, right? And so there's been a lot of work following up on that to suggest that initial interpretation was actually off and wrong. And because what you find, for example, is that you might even get larger amygdala responses among people who say that they are more motivated to avoid being prejudiced. So, I think that there are a lot of other projects from the neuroscience realm, and I'll just mention one other that I think are really important because they start to unpack how it is that really low-level processes contribute to very high-level consequences. So, for example, there's been work for a long time now looking at which regions of the brain are most sensitive to representing faces, and specifically identities. So being able to distinguish person A from person B. And there was very early work by Jennifer Eberhardt and her colleagues in 2000, 2001, where they identified that among white participants, for example, people exhibited less of a difference in activation across two distinct black identities, so black person A versus black person B, as compared to when looking at white person A versus white person B, which they took to mean that there was that was the neural signature of there being a less of a distinctive or refined representation of outgroup faces, which could lead to things like misidentification, for example, in lineups and confusion of people. And then much more recent evidence, including a paper of ours, basically confirms this with bigger sample sizes and more advanced methodology. But in any case, it's just to suggest that, there are so many different modalities that feed into all of the racist behaviors and consequences that we see, right, that are given rise to today. So it's not just about how people feel; it's also things about their sensory perception, right? What machinery they bring to bear when they're perceiving people that are in groups versus out groups. And there's tons of work that needs to be done in this area. Again, I emphasize that so much of this work is really focused on white participants as opposed to looking at participants of all demographics and looking at how it is that these things interact. And there's lots of beautiful work. Anyway, I'll stop there. I could go on for much longer. I know we only have a little bit of time, but I'll stop there.
Thank you. That's great, and that tees me up sort of for something to say on that, which is that our brains really are statistical pattern formation devices. They're learning about their environments, and so one of the things that we're learning a lot from animal models is how much that pattern detection and learning depends on the environment in which you grow up. And so if you grow up in a very homogeneous environment, that will be the pattern that your brain learns to make distinctions amongst, and then whereas everything that is sort of like different and you don't understand very well. So there's beautiful work in rats, for example, showing that, and rats show an empathy-like behavior. If they see a rat who's trapped in a tube, they'll work to release them from that tube. And a white rat raised with white rats will literally help a white rat. Black rat raised with black rats will help a black rat, but not a white rat. And a white rat raised in a community of black and white rats will help everybody. So this is not meant to excuse the behavior that we see in people, because we have control over what we do and how we think and how we regulate our behavior. But it does, I think, put it into kind of a more evolutionary context in the way that sort of brains are designed to learn about their environments through the process of development. And with that, I'm going to now kind of jump to a question I think everybody here can address from their own perspective, which is, in some sense, how fluid is group membership? And how does that relate to this sort of growing kind of coalescence around this idea of intersectionality? And so how, which on the one hand is sort of dividing the world up into ever more categories, but on the other hand, we feel like perhaps what we need to be emphasizing is unity rather than individuation. Anybody can take that question.
Well, I'll just put one finger on everything that I said before, which is that these, as you mentioned, none of this is hardwired because it's in the brain and it's super highly flexible. So, for example, you can completely invert people's brain responses to, say, black and white faces if you reshuffle them and say, yeah, but these black and white faces are on your team and these black and white faces are not on your team. So now you start to get amygdala responses to your own group. Which at least suggests that these are highly, highly flexible. And so category membership may not be the critical thing here. It's really what your values and goals are. It's just that category membership often aligns with said goals and values. And so people begin to think that the thing that matters is a person's demographics. But as you say, which demographic you belong to could be super highly context dependent.
Just to add to that, there's a lot of research showing that the social categories that we belong to, are so overlapping and are very fluid. And so, you can think of yourself in terms of your racial category, but you can also think in terms of your gender category and the intersections between those, et cetera, et cetera. And there's a lot of cool research trying to get people to use larger, higher order categories to transcend those. So stop thinking of ourselves in terms of our race, but, we're all Americans together in this, or we're all citizens of the world, et cetera. And so I think there's some promising directions to go there. But the thing to keep in mind is that, at the end of the day, we tend to revert to those social categories or those social identities that are sort of reinforced by the surroundings around us. And it's the structures in the environment around us that keep us focused on race, for example, when it could be other categories that we might be more identified with. And so what I mean by the structures around us is that, if your school or workplace is basically arranged as a hierarchy where race is a very salient way of differentiating the people at the top versus the bottom of that hierarchy, then even though psychologically these categories could be very fluid, if every day you go back into that situation, that's the social identity that's going to be really salient and important to you.
I guess the only thing that I would add to what you both have said is just to sort of amplify the sense of how important context is, and not only the immediate context that you were talking about, but also the sort of longer historical structural context of the emergence of what we understand to be the modern world, the capitalist modern world, and the foundations of those systems of economy, of politics, of social hierarchies, et cetera, and the ways that they play out over time. They may not always be the most salient thing in somebody's mind in an interaction, but it shapes the possibilities for those interactions. I think I read recently a study that showed that upwards of 75% of white Americans do not have African Americans in their intimate social networks. Maybe a coworker, maybe a colleague, but not an intimate friend. And it was an argument for creating and maintaining a more diverse immediate network in order to change some of those responses and to create the forms of empathy that you're talking about, Michael. Rats, of course, but with humans as well.
Right. Well, similar mechanisms. But how do we do that, Deb? I think it's what is the way in which we kind of can engage in that? Is that social engineering, or is this more of a marketing kind of thing in terms of encouraging people to diversify their social network? If it's not going to happen just sort of de novo structurally.
Yeah, I don't know how that happens. People select homogeneity in a number of ways by moving to the suburbs when they have kids, or these kinds of phenomena, and it just creates a different set of interactions. The quarantine has generated, I think, some interesting reconfigurations. So, for example, I've now been on weekly calls with an old group of friends from my alma mater, in which we've been talking about these kinds of issues a lot, because for some of the white people in that group, we found out that they had actually never had a substantial interaction with a Black American or a Black person from anywhere else in the world until they got to Brown. And whereas my life has, because I'm a child of a mixed marriage and raised in Jamaica, but also in the United States, where if you're mixed, you're considered Black up to a certain generational moment. My entire life was an interracial situation. So it was never odd to sort of think across those boundaries. And it had never occurred to me that people didn't have that training, which I guess is what it would be. So I don't know how to legislate integration in the ways that segregation was formerly legislated, but I think part of it is just for people to recognize that that is their world, and that there are benefits in moving beyond that history and that world.
Yeah, I was one of those white kids who grew up. I had a class of 600 in my high school, not a single Black person in that class, and it was only when I got to college that other races. So, I mean, incredible. Deborah, I want to continue this questioning, but it's going to spread to the other panelists. And, cultural anthropology, ethnography, kind of long ago began to embrace activism and political behavior as part of the scholarship. But that's been something that us in neuroscience, other sciences have certainly avoided steadfastly, but we now feel like we're at a moment where we might be really called upon to embrace that. I'm wondering if you can provide a little historical perspective on that. Keith, what they think about
I think I missed the very end of that. A little historical background on
So how did that come about in cultural anthropology? That is sort of more of a movement from, objectivity to subjectivity, and then to go the next step to activism, advocacy, politically oriented scholarship, and activism. And I want to then kind of hear from Mina and Keith about their thoughts on this for the sciences.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Anthropology is sometimes like a turn-off discipline to a lot of college students, and especially college students of color who haven't encountered it before and then encounter it as a modality of racism. Which, we often talk about American anthropology in terms of its anti-racist history, which has been very strong and important, and I'll talk about that in a second apropos of your question. But it also has a long history in supporting the development of scientific racism, and people in my own department, Penn is one of the oldest anthropology departments and the oldest anthropology museums in the world, and it has a very checkered past with particular individuals and scholars who really supported racist belief systems. That said, the founder, the more modern founder of what we understand as American anthropology, Franz Boas, was deeply engaged in anti-racist activity from the very early 20th century. And so the problems that he initiated and set into movement within the American Academy of Anthropology across the four fields, biological, linguistic, cultural, and archaeological, were really toward separating a notion of race from a notion of culture, and arguing against the innate hierarchy of what some had come to understand as racial types around the globe. And I think if we understand American anthropology's inauguration as an activist inauguration, because he was explicitly an activist, not only in the classroom, but in relation to policy making and policy circles, then it wouldn't seem odd that contemporary anthropologists are also working within that framework. I think what emerges as the sort of defining moment in relation to what people perceive as a shift is a move away from a sense that there is an objective knowledge toward a more sense of historically contextualized and specified forms of knowledge that are grounded in conditions of power and histories of inequality, et cetera, which one would sort of identify with a French philosophical moment in the 1970s. And I think after that, anthropologists stopped imagining themselves as studying societies as a whole and started being more problem-based, or conceptualizing their research in more problem-oriented questions. And people see that as then a form of advocacy. And there are some within the field of cultural anthropology who also decry that, but I think that's pretty much the norm. At this point, most anthropologists who are seeking the answer in a variety of ways to why things are the way they are, are trying to advocate for something better than what they are, and trying to stand alongside people who are creating a different vision for what the world could be, and who are struggling to bring into being a different kind of reality. So I guess that's how I would begin to think about the kind of question that you raise.
Yeah, so just to expand upon what Deborah was saying, I think, at least in psychology, in my own personal experience, some of this move that I see in the field toward being more activist and engaged in policy discussions and things like that has come from an increased awareness that we need to be communicating our science outside of just academic circles. And so if you get outside of just publishing journal articles or academic kinds of publications and start engaging with the wider community, you have to be ready to answer the sort of so what questions. Why do I need to care? Or what can we actually do about it? How can I use this knowledge in my life? And that process, certainly I see that happening for me, but I see it happening in psychology and neuroscience more generally, probably the social sciences as a whole, who haven't been already on board that train, that there's an increasing need, if we're going to talk to wider circles of the general public and policymakers, to formulate our questions and our research conclusions in ways that have relevance for policy outcomes, right? And so all of us got involved in whatever areas of research we're interested in because of value-laden reasons that we care. And so I think it's always been a bit of a false note whenever we pretend that we're just generating purely objective research results. There's always been a value-ladenness to it. And I think being able to put that on the table and talk about why we care, and also what can you do about it if you care, more explicitly, rather than sort of saying that as a silent assumption, is actually very helpful.
I might just add that I think psychology is woefully unaware of their blind spot, and I'm going to pull neuroscience into this too. Woefully unaware of the blind spot that, we study a very small percentage of the population of the world, but we want to be able to make generalizable claims about human condition and psychology across the board, and how it is the brain functions, as though there was some sort of universal experience. I think that in trying to overreach in our generalizability of our claims, we've actually marginalized ourselves, because we don't go to the trouble of going to do the work, testing these questions across different populations, pushing beyond Western educated, industrialized, rich and democratic countries. If we want to learn something about humans universally, then we actually have to go ask those questions there. And, I think another way in which this sort of manifests itself is that the assumptions that go into the way that we ask the questions in the first place, right? And like we were, as I mentioned before, working only with white participants to try to understand racism. There's so many limitations of this kind, and we so rarely grapple with them because we want our science to be taken seriously. But I think in order for it to be taken seriously, we have to admit those limitations because they're vast.
Thank you. Yes, those are all really, really important points you made. I want to ask Zab whether we might bring some folks who've been asking questions in the chat.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we've been getting a lot of questions that I think Keith, you might be able to provide some insight in. I think a lot of people in business, for example, are being inundated with the idea of implicit bias training and interventions. And there's not a lot of knowledge, I think, about, and there haven't been a lot of studies about how long something might last, whether we can do something on the individual level. It would be really great to hear something, about your theory around, your bias of crowds idea, because I think maybe a lot of our listeners aren't knowledgeable about that. And I think that could help us, have a discussion about what can you change about the environmental levels of bias. And I think that would be really, that will hit a lot of the questions that we're getting, like, is it important to target children? Is it important to continue to do these kinds of, are these interventions helpful at all? All of this, yeah.
Right. Yeah, so I study implicit bias. I've spent 20 years studying implicit bias. I think implicit bias is an interesting and important thing to study. Having said that, I get asked to do quote-unquote implicit bias trainings a lot. And my response is always, I don't know what that means. We don't know how to train people's implicit biases. And but I would be happy to speak to your group about how racism works in organizations and systems, even for people who don't think they're biased, right? So when we're talking about implicit bias, especially with reference to implicit bias training in workplaces and other kinds of organizations, I think we need to think about implicit bias as a canary in the coal mine. It's a marker of the kinds of situations people are engaged in. So what we know about the research on changing implicit bias is that it's actually incredibly easy to change implicit bias. All you have to do is wait a day for the individual, because it fluctuates from day to day, hour to hour, radically for the individual. But the average level of implicit bias in a city, a county, a college campus, an organization is actually incredibly stable. And it's because the situations and the hierarchies represented in those contexts are stable. So I think the goal shouldn't be to change individuals' implicit biases, because they're not a stable individual difference trait like a belief or a personality trait to begin with. It just reflects, and this is the bias of crowds idea that you mentioned. I've come to believe, and this has become a focus of our research, the evidence looks like it's much more reflective of our immediate situation, the immediate social environment, and the degree of inequalities and stereotypes around us, than it is about something about the person that I carry around with me as an individual difference. And so if we want to change implicit bias in organizations, I think it's great to do educational sessions and learn about this stuff. But rather than targeting the implicit biases in people's heads, we need to focus on the structures and the inequalities around them. That, we need to focus on the coal mine and not the canary that's just signaling it.
Great, thanks very much. So I think that other people have been pointing out on the message board, have been pointing out that there are a tremendous number of biases, not in just samples, like you had suggested, but also in methodologies. For example, that there are issues around and measurements because of differences between hair, and access that create bottlenecks, I think, in diversifying. What can we do as neuroscientists to further creating both neurotechnology methodologies that are more equitable, but also be able to sample wider demographics.
Well, I think to start, we should certainly hire more Black, Indigenous, and people of color into our faculty because they're going to ask different questions and have very different reference points when approaching these particular questions and ideas about what the reasonable experiments are to run. I mean, my favorite example of this is that, in social psychology for 40, 50 years, intergroup intervention research has been getting about groups to like each other. But that's because people who have power also want to be liked. And that's because the people who've been doing the research have power. When you talk to people who are disproportionately less powerful, they want to be respected. They want to be heard. They want access to resources. They want to be treated equitably. They don't need anybody necessarily to like them. So, that emphasis on getting everybody to get along is a byproduct of who's asking the question, right? And assuming what the correct goal is as an outcome of the intervention. And I think that the same thing is true for all of the research that we're doing now in neuroscience in terms of who's asking the question, who's being asked to answer the question, and the kinds of inferences we're making from the data.
Yeah, Mina, just follow on that. I mean, what role do you think the people who provide the funding for this kind of research, any research in general? I mean, so the vast majority of neuroscience research is funded by the National Health on basic science and clinical translation. But it seems to me that there's a huge public health relevance, et cetera, here. And how can we move forward without the money to actually do the right kinds of research that we need to do?
I mean, I think we lobby that we need the money. We can't do it without the money, right? I mean, we convince them. So I've had experiences where NIH officers tell me, I don't want to see the word group, stereotype, or discrimination in your application because we just won't fund it. And I know not to apply. I get all my funding from NSF instead. But that, as you say, is an absurd position to take because of the public health relevance of all of these issues. So I would say that we just need to lobby NIH harder.
I think we have a great question from Justin Thompson. If he's got a camera or is willing to ask his question, I think Deborah could probably take a stab at that question. Justin? Right. If not,
yes,
okay.
I'm here. So my question was from a historical perspective. We've always seen a backlash when African Americans are making progress in this country. So I'm wondering, I feel like inevitably there's going to be some kind of backlash from all of this. I'm wondering from a psychological perspective, how do we prevent that from happening?
I'm not sure I have the answer to that question, not being a psychologist. But that's always been the case. And actually, I saw a few days ago a really interesting video put up by Gary Young, who is a Black British journalist who has written for The Guardian forever, but who's also now involved in a kind of independent journalism project. And he's talking about violence and the response to violence and how to think about rioting within the context that we're seeing right now. And his main point is that violence begets violence, and we cannot understand manifestations of violence within social protest outside of a longer history of violence in terms of policy, state formation, etc. But he also says that, there is, just to use a very small example, the peaceful protesting of Colin Kaepernick did nothing. And it's now being invoked as a way to understand a form of protest today, right? Whereas last year and the year before it marginalized him, and he was trying to do a peaceful protest. So he's trying to get us to think differently about methods of social change and how we understand what is needed in the moment. I think there's always a backlash. One could argue that the entire Trump presidency is a backlash to 8 years of Obama, and many have. So I don't think that we have seen this level of commitment globally to the kinds of protest and change that people want to see, and the kinds of discussions that are happening right now have not happened on this large of a scale in my lifetime anyway. And so it'll be interesting to see where things are in 5 months.
Great.
I'll
And
just
I
add
think
this.
oh, go ahead, Keith. Go ahead.
I was just going to say there's some interesting research from, I'm thinking of the political scientist Chris Wetzel and others looking at sort of measuring progress toward more sort of humanist thought over time around the world. And it's not the case that there's always progress, but in areas where there is progress, it tends to look like, a really noisy line like the stock market going up over time, And so I think within any particular time period, it's hard to know whether you're in the progress or the backlash portion. But zooming out over in historical timescales, it's easier to see where the larger trends are. And I think, hopefully right now is a moment moving forward.
Right. And what I was going to say is that sort of moves us to, we're in our last few minutes, but it moves us to, what we had said was, action. So I think, what we've been talking about, right, are our biases, power changes, but, all the things that sort of make up this. But I think, if we could spend a few minutes, if I could hear from each of you about what you think might move the dial the most in collective action, what from your own body of work is going to be the most effective form. Do we have to wait for the stock market to for the line to move a lot? What are we looking at?
The stock market.
Go ahead. Please go ahead.
Sorry, I meant Keith's stock market line. Sorry, not the actual stock market. Sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to laugh and say the stock market doesn't appear to care very much about the current situation. Yeah, no, I was just going to say that I think the education that has been promulgated by groups like Black Lives Matter over the last 5 years has really been focused on solutions come from the communities who are experiencing the distress. And if we listened to people's own solutions, people's own projects, etc., that would be the starting place for real change instead of the implementation of a top-down solution. So if we're looking at policing, for example, and we understand what the history of policing is and that it's rooted in the attempt to control the ability of enslaved persons to move off of plantations, etc., then we would understand that we need to develop solutions from those who have been leaders within the communities who are hardest hit. So I do feel that this moment has generated such a groundswell of committed activity and committed long-term activity day after day after day after day. And now it is really incumbent on everybody to listen to what local community leaders are suggesting for the forms of change they want to see in their communities.
Can I tack on to Deborah? I want to say that I think that what's really also important in fomenting change here and the orientation to listening to these community leaders is the understanding that the norms among overrepresented and dominant groups have changed. So some of the craziest data I've ever seen are looking at, you ask people how acceptable it is to be prejudiced against a group, and then you ask them how prejudiced they are against that group. This is work by Chris Crandall and colleagues. The relationship between those is almost one. It's almost perfectly correlated. So basically what that says is that people are as prejudiced as they think it's acceptable to be based on their local reference, whether that's their community members, their church members, their village, their whatever it is. And so to the extent that that norm, that it's not okay to be prejudiced, is going to pervade throughout the community, then that's really going to change people's orientation and sensitivity and capacity for listening to these community leaders who have a different perspective. And you see this also in legislation, right? So for example, Betsy Levy-Pollack has work where she looks at attitudes towards how likely people think attitudes towards gay marriage are going to change, how likely they are to get more accepting, more progressive before versus after the Supreme Court rendered their decision. And what you find is that even if people don't find gay marriage more acceptable themselves, they think that everybody else thinks that it's going to be more acceptable now. So there can also be these sort of top-down legislative shifts in communicating the norms and values of the nation, and this works at the state and the city and so on and so forth. And so I think that there's a lot of opportunity via norms as channels to shift people's sort of minds and hearts. And even if not their minds and hearts, at least their behavior in the meantime.
Great. Well, we're at time, so I want to be cognizant of everyone's time and let people get on with their day. But thank you very much to our incredible panelists. Thank you for all the attendee questions. They've been really great. I think there are so many more places for us to go in this conversation. And I think we're right at the tip of the iceberg of change. I hope so. And I think we need to have more and more of these conversations to really,
Here's your dog.
So
I hope
thank you,
your dog
everybody.
is okay.
Okay. Thank you, everybody.
And we hope to see you in a session soon. Thank you, Keith, Mina, Deborah, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.